Resident Evil is a game that needs little introduction. For over 27 years, the series Capcom has created has grown into a massive franchise that encompasses multiple medias. Regardless of first-hand experience, I'm sure someone might have with the series, I'm sure almost everyone has at least heard of it. There are games, movies, novels, comics, apparel, and several other miscellaneous items scattered about, so it comes as no surprise. However, despite all the ways people have to jump into RE, many of the options out there are not interconnecting to the source material. Hell, a lot of the times even the main series strays a little far away from its own storyline, much like a mutation, but I digress. With all the aforementioned ways to dive into Resident Evil, sometimes it's good to look at how it all started.
Resident Evil.
Ah yeah, what the title card said. Resident Evil is a classic hailing from the PlayStation 1 era of gaming. This was during the time where games were cutting their teeth on early aspects of 3 dimensions, video games were becoming more popular with a wider demographic, and competition was really beginning to heat up. As such, experimental testing and new concepts was at an all-time high.
Any clues?
No, but something's wrong with this house.
Well, the original Resident Evil came out in 1996. I'm going to be talking about the director's cut version. The director's cut version released in the US in September of 1997.
No! Don't go!
This is the game that has resonated with me, as well as countless other gamers that grew up through the 90s generation of gaming. Whereas most other games were giving the player ample amounts of lives, items, and ammo to make their way through the story, Resident Evil took a much more punishing approach on how it treated people brave enough to pick it up. This was the birth of survival horror. While other games prior had elements that inspired the term, Resident Evil would set the standard as we know it today. Before we get into what made the gameplay what it was, I think now would be a good time to talk a little bit about the story, though.
Chris? Stop it.
What is this all about?
The game starts off by giving you the option of 2 characters, Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield. They are members of an elite police force called Special Tactics and Rescue Services, or as we all like to call them, STARS. We are then briefed on a series of murder cases that Hannibal Lecter would find amusing. What we don't find amusing is now that our Bravo team has gone missing in their investigation. It isn't long before we see exactly how fast things can go from bad to worse. With our city's finest pilot hightailing it out of Dodge, we are left sprinting over the forest and through the woods. Sadly, it's not to Grandma's house that we find, it's the Spencer estate. And this is where we find ourselves in control, by trying to get control of the situation and get out of this nightmare we found ourselves in.
Can't figure it out at all.
Depending on which character you choose, you will find that inventory space differs between them. With Jill, you'll have 8 item spaces to fill and will be equipped with their standard issue handgun. Chris, adversely, will start with a knife and only 6 pockets to stuff. What doesn't differ from the characters is how they're moved around the environment. That's right, we're now talking about the infamous tank controls.
Stay alert!
As I mentioned earlier, 3D environments were still a new frontier at the time Resident Evil came into the picture. As such, there was no universal way for a player to move an avatar in every direction. Tank controls, in short, utilize the up button to move forward and the back to walk backwards, with the left and the right pivoting your character to move in those respective directions. Now, I grew up with these controls, and to me, they just feel kind of right in the level design. Had this been a platforming game, however, there might have been a few more reservations on the situation. But this is a survival horror game. The survival horror game, and they hit just right for that kind of gameplay. As for the survival horror genre, the term survival horror as of late has been used to describe the majority of horror games as a whole. However, the core of what makes survival horror what it really is boils down to a few key elements. Limited weapon and healing items, challenging environments, and overwhelming odds. In essence, you should never feel like you have the upper hand in every situation. Rather, staying alive should be the key objective, and you should feel the increasing tension from the world around you.
Wesker!
Chris, you're alive.
My words exactly.
In a basic nutshell, the game is spread out into 4 interconnecting levels: the main mansion, the guardhouse, the underground, and a lab, all joined by a fenced-in backyard complete with self-contained dam. But hey, that's free real estate. Speaking of free real estate, the larger portion of this game will have you backtracking to familiar and sometimes not quite so familiar locales within the labyrinthian design that Spencer created. Scraping and scrounging for uniquely crafted keys via puzzles and clues that one would think Da Vinci himself had sculpted. Each of these hurdles that you'll navigate through are filled with undead horrors, monsters, and a heavy speckling of a hostile work environment, all which seem to leave a heavy atmosphere of despair in the air as your situation seems to dwell closer to the shambling former residence as your ammo dwells closer to empty. While my initial thoughts on the massive house's architecture lingered on the horrifying lack of bathrooms in the main house, it then began to shift to the everyday struggles that inhabitants must have had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Now, I'm sure teamwork made the dream work, but I can't imagine being the guy who had to do shift changes with hexagon cave cranks, or beginning an end-of-shift sprints to the bunkhouse due to the rain of poisonous asps on the forest. I realize I'm overthinking these things, but that's what happens when you get stumped by a riddle and come to the conclusion that you would be in the same boat as Chris when trying to play a piano.
It's me, Chris.
Is that you, Rebecca?
From a gameplay perspective, the Spencer estate is elaborately designed in an intricate way that keeps you moving through the halls in the right way towards a conclusion. Each piece of the mansion flows together in a relatively seamless fashion thanks to the layout of the key items, and of course, conveniently disguised loading times hidden behind door transitions. Of course, being the mad genius that Spencer was, simply finding keys is not quite enough to unlock the next area. Multiple unique traps have to be dealt with and structural fittings inserted to give you access to those keys. Initial playthroughs may be frustrating, but given time and experience in the genre, you'll begin to understand how game developers intended for you to solve the mysteries.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
As if the mansion itself was not daunting enough, you'll quickly realize that the original inhabitants of the mansion are still wandering about the halls, and although they're not faring quite as well as they once were, these zombies quickly make themselves known as you first encounter one making a Kenneth sandwich out of one of your team members. This first look at zombies being brought to life on Sony's PlayStation is pretty much an iconic part of the console's history, and will most likely resonate within some part of the gamer's brains that grew up with it from back in the day. I will confess that 9-year-old me had an additional displeasure becoming the second course, and likewise witnessing my first vivid death scene in gaming, but I digress. Outside of the undead, there are a plethora of other experiments against humanity gone wrong in the form of giant insects, reptiles, arachnids, and plants with a sudden hankering for human-flavored snacks, each of which inhabit different portions of the estate. The insane collective of scientists in the name of science and some mad man's pocketbook were tinkering with DNA from the aforementioned animals, and of course humans, in an attempt to make a more effective bioweapon. As the story continues onward, we come to realize that they had absolutely worked their delicious science magic in that endeavor.
What the hell is this?
Barry!
Jill!
As you push on through the property, you'll get bits of information as to who's responsible for this whole mess. Now, with that said, I do have to drop a small spoiler warning to anyone that hasn't played this game yet, but somehow found themselves this far into my review. You've been warned. Now, after painstakingly searching for a way out of this hellhole, you're led to a laboratory that is filled with the science magic equipment, all with Umbrella's logo imprinted on it. This corporate entity, in its infinite wisdom, has been working on creating a weaponized virus that gives dead things a second chance at life, and a new refresh on what's already existing in this world. Turns out that the captain of your STARS team is the mastermind behind this whole mess. A keen eye around the mansion would have caught onto this fact with hints to Wesker's name, and a mission to collect information on BOW's combat capacity. This all culminates in Wesker double-crossing you and playing a game of show and tell. You know, classic bad guy stuff. Sharing the fact that he has a big boy, Wesker wants to test him out on you for delicious combat data. His big boy's name is Tyrant. But Tyrant has other ideas on how to celebrate his freedom and decides to turn against Wesker, giving him the inaugural kill before turning to you. Take down the ultimate failure and get ready for a series staple. Get the hell out of the lab, and hopefully you have the opportunity to leave with a portion of your team, depending on how events played out in the mansion and the choices you've made. Of course, you're not leaving without a grand finale. Our good old friend Tyrant makes one last appearance on the helipad, conveniently above the labs. Unload all the remaining ammo you have into him, and give him a going-away present courtesy of the helicopter pilot. Fly off into the sunset, then head down to the Winchester, grab a pint, and wait for all of this to blow over.
See? Just relax and play.
All right.
Resident Evil is a fantastic game, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to pick it up again recently to drive home that fact, as opposed to talking through just a nostalgic lens. While tank controls and movement can sometimes feel a bit stiff after an extended period break, it's a lot like riding a bike. You don't really unlearn, you just get a little rusty. Now I'll come right out and say that this is not an easy game. While there are several more challenging games in the franchise, Resident Evil is going to leave you frustrated on first time and early playthroughs. Hell, even a self-proclaimed expert in the series like myself can get smacked around if I get a little too comfortable. There are times I'll be running down a hall and realize that I didn't leave myself enough inventory space for the items I needed to pick up, and I'm pretty sure I left those hunters alive 3 rooms ago. But at the end of the day, however, that's what makes survival horror what it is. A challenge to overcome, a puzzle to solve, an alternative route to discover. The original story was also reminiscent of an old 90s zombie horror film in many ways. Full of the right types of cheese and to fit that kind of camp, it just holds an awkward charm about it. If you haven't had the opportunity to play Resident Evil and consider yourself a horror game fan, find a copy right away and give it a try. This is one of the classics from the PlayStation library, and even if it doesn't feel like it, it may have very well had a direct influence on your favorite games today. Who knows, you might find a new appreciation for the hunger it creates. You know, for itchy taste. Thanks for watching. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. Resident Evil is a series that means a great deal to me, and sometimes it's kind of hard to put those thoughts into coherent structure. This was also my first retrospective on a game, instead of plastering my face all over gameplay footage and going to town, as I do. I'm hoping to start doing more reviews as time goes on, but feel free to let me know what you'd like to see down in the comments. As always, keep on rocking everybody, have a good one, and stay Brawn.